My daughter-in-law's hand shot out. The frame crashed to the floor. My late husband's photo lay in shards. She smirked. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I picked up my pen and erased her name from my will, my deeds, my accounts, every place she'd ever tried to plant herself. By the time she noticed, it was too late. All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The parlor was quiet, except for the soft sweep of Helen Crawford's duster across the mantel. Outside, a Savannah morning was stretching itself awake, light spilling through lace curtains, the faint tang of the river riding on a warm breeze. The wedding photo of Helen and her late husband, Daniel, sat at the center, framed in walnut, the glass polished to a shine just minutes before. The side door banged open hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Tara Crawford's heels struck the hardwood in rapid-fire beats, her perfume arriving before her voice. Her eyes were already hot with temper, her breath sharp. You might want to talk to your son, she said, pacing across the parlor rug without invitation. Because he's making decisions without me, and I'm not going to stand for it. Helen didn't look up from her dusting. Daniel's photo stood between them, a quiet sentinel. Tara's gaze landed on it, narrowing slightly. You still keep this here? She asked, her tone more accusation than curiosity. Before Helen could answer, Tara's hand shot out, not to straighten the frame, but to shove it. The frame toppled, striking the hearth with a dull crack, before the glass shattered in a burst of crystalline sound. Fragments skittered across the floor, catching the sunlight in brief, mocking flashes. Michael appeared in the doorway, breathless as if he'd run from the street. He froze when he saw the shards and the look on his mother's face. Tara, it was an accident, Tara said quickly, though the slight lift at one corner of her mouth told another story. Helen lowered herself to the floor, knees pressing into the cool hardwood, and began gathering the largest shards. Her fingers moved with deliberate care, lifting each jagged piece without a word. Daniel's youthful face, 22, proud in his navy uniform, smiled at her from behind the fractured glass. She didn't touch his image, afraid the pressure might splinter the paper. Mom, let me. Michael stepped forward. I've got it, Helen said evenly. The steadiness in her voice made Michael hesitate. Tara shifted her weight, crossing her arms. Her heel tapped against the rug in impatient rhythm. It's just a picture, she murmured, but the words cut sharper than the glass. Helen rose, her palm heavy with broken pieces, and walked them to the kitchen trash. They landed with a sound like loose change. When she returned, Tara was already turning toward the door, Michael trailing after her with that strained look he wore when trying to keep peace where none existed. Hours later, the broken frame sat on Helen's potting bench in the backyard. The air carried the smell of damp soil from last night's rain. Bees hovered lazily over late-blooming roses, oblivious to the hollow weight in her chest. She traced the split in the walnut frame with her fingertip, feeling its rough edge. Marjorie Ellis arrived just after 3, a tin of lemon bars in hand, her usual Tuesday visit. She paused at the sight of Helen's expression. You look like you've been swallowing sand all day, Marjorie said, settling into one of the wicker chairs on the porch. Helen hadn't planned to tell her, but Marjorie's gaze had a way of unlocking doors Helen thought she'd latched. So she recounted it all, the slammed door, the pointed question, the deliberate push, the crash. Michael's silence. Tara's smirk. Marjorie listened without interrupting, her brows lifting only once, her hands still except for the slow turning of her tea glass. When Helen finished, the garden was quiet except for the low hum of insects. Marjorie leaned forward, her voice steady and certain. If she can smash that, she said, you can smash her place in your life. The afternoon light slanted low across Helen Crawford's dining room table, spilling in through the bay window and catching the edges of thick manila folders. The smell of lemon oil lingered from the morning's dusting, but the air itself felt heavier, as if the shattered glass from earlier still floated somewhere between the walls. She had pulled her will from the locked drawer, along with the binder holding her family trust. The cover was worn smooth in spots from years of her careful handling. She slipped on her reading glasses and began scanning each page with the slow precision of someone counting money they intended to spend well. Daniel's name appeared in all the old clauses, steady and familiar, but then she saw it. Tara Crawford. Not once, not twice. 5 times threaded through her legacy like an uninvited guest who had made herself comfortable. Secondary beneficiary on the house, the vacation property, a small investment account, even a section of the trust set aside for family emergencies. Helen leaned back in her chair, the paper cool between her fingers. It was remarkable how a name could look so harmless in ink when in reality it was a hand poised to take. She tapped her pen against the table, her pulse steady. By 4 o'clock, she was in Charles Benton's office downtown. The building's old brick facade glowed warm in the late-day sun, and the scent of coffee drifted from the cafe next door. Charles greeted her in his usual quiet way, ushering her into a room lined with legal books and soft lamplight. She slid the binder across his desk. "I want her name gone, from all of it." Charles flipped through the documents with the speed of someone who had been reading fine print for decades. "We can change this immediately," he said without looking up. "Wills, trusts, beneficiary designations, all of it is under your control while you're living." Helen's shoulders dropped a fraction. "Good." He glanced at her, a small approving nod forming at the corner of his mouth. "Most people wait too long to correct a mistake. You're ahead of the curve." On the walk back to her car, Helen's phone buzzed in her handbag. "Michael," she stared at his name for a moment before answering. "Mom, I heard you're thinking about changing things." His voice was careful, as though stepping on thin ice. "I'm not thinking," she said, unlocking the car. "I'm doing. Just keep the peace, okay? We don't need more fighting." Helen looked out at the line of moss-draped oaks along the sidewalk. "Peace isn't made by pretending damage didn't happen." She ended the call before he could reply. Back home, Marjorie was already on the porch, rocking gently in the wicker chair, a thin breeze stirring her hair. "I had a feeling you'd be in town," she said, sipping from her glass of iced tea. Helen told her about the names on the documents, the meeting with Charles, and Michael's phone call. Marjorie's expression didn't flicker. "I'll witness the updates," she said simply, as though she'd been waiting for Helen to ask. That night, Helen sat at her kitchen table with the binder open once more. She imagined Tara's surprise if she knew how much of Helen's life she'd been quietly penciled into. That wouldn't last. Helen wasn't interested in leaving her husband's legacy, or her own, in hands that treated a photograph like clutter. Her pen rested on the desk beside her tea, ready for tomorrow. The phone rang at exactly 8:15 p.m. Helen answered. Charles' voice was calm, precise. "We can start tomorrow," he said. The morning air in Savannah was cool enough to carry the faint bite of river breeze as Helen walked up the stone steps of Charles Benton's office. Her shoes clicked against the worn marble floor inside, the sound echoing faintly in the high-ceilinged hallway. She clutched the leather folder of documents under her arm like a shield. Charles' receptionist greeted her with a polite smile and led her into the inner office. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long bars of light across shelves packed with law books. Charles rose from behind his desk, a fountain pen already in hand. "Ready?" he asked. Helen nodded. "Ready?" He opened the binder to the first page of the will, the paper thick and crisp. "We'll start here." Removing her name from every clause where she appears as a beneficiary. These changes will redirect those designations to the Crawford Military Scholarship Fund, just as we discussed. Helen's eyes traced the lines where Tara Crawford had been neatly typed, then crossed out in firm black ink. Charles had already filled in the scholarship's name in its place. The letters looked solid, immovable. She took the pen, the cool weight of it settling between her fingers. Her signature flowed in practiced loops, each stroke a quiet act of reclaiming. She signed again on the trust documents, the ink gliding across legal language that had once assumed permanence. Marjorie, seated in the chair across from her, leaned forward to sign as a witness. "Smooth pen," she remarked lightly. though her gaze on Helen held something steady and approving. The notary stamp came down with a soft thud, the embossed seal leaving its precise imprint on the corner of the pages. Charles double-checked each document before stacking them neatly. "That's it," he said, sliding the folder toward her. "Legally, she's no longer entitled to a cent from your estate. These changes are effective immediately." Helen let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The room smelled faintly of leather-bound books and the paper's clean ink. Outside, a church bell tolled 11. As they rose, Charles walked her to the door. "I've seen plenty of clients make changes like these," he said quietly, "but not all of them do it with such certainty." Helen met his gaze. "Certainty comes easy when you've seen someone's true face." Back on the sidewalk, the sun had grown warmer, drawing the scent of blooming jasmine from the vines climbing the iron fences. Helen carried the folder like a prize won in a long private battle. Marjorie looped her arm through Helen's. "You're lighter," she said. "I am," Helen admitted, and she meant it. Her steps felt steadier, her spine a little straighter. They parted at the corner, Marjorie heading toward the bakery, Helen toward her car parked beneath a moss-covered oak. She set the folder gently on the passenger seat, as if it were a living thing, and started the engine. Halfway home, her phone rang through the car's speakers. The display lit with Amy Delgado. Helen pressed the call button. "Mrs. Crawford?" Amy's voice carried the warm efficiency Helen had come to expect. "I heard from Charles about your estate updates. While we're at it, you might want to consider changing the payable on death designations on your accounts. It's a simple process, but it makes sure no surprises happen down the line." Helen glanced at the folder beside her. "Tell me what I need to bring." Amy's answer was brisk but decisive. "Just yourself and some ID. We can get it done this week." The light turned green, but Helen didn't ease her foot onto the gas right away. She sat for a moment listening to the faint hum of the car and the echo of Amy's words. The bank's double-glass doors parted with a soft hiss as Helen stepped inside, the conditioned air instantly cooling the lingering warmth from the Savannah street. The faint scent of polished wood and brewed coffee drifted through the lobby, mingling with the muted hum of printers and the quiet tap of keys. Amy Delgado spotted her immediately from behind the customer desk. She rose, her dark hair pulled into a neat twist, a smile tugging at her mouth. "Mrs. Crawford, I've got us a private room ready." Helen followed her past rows of cubicles to a small office with a window overlooking the street. Sunlight caught the edge of the polished conference table, and a neat stack of forms waited in the center, each topped with a blue pen. "Let's start with your checking and savings accounts," Amy said, sliding the first set of papers toward her. "Currently the payable on death beneficiary is Tara Crawford." The name sat there in neat black ink, ordinary and poisonous. Helen's hand didn't hesitate as she drew a straight line through it. "Remove her. Replace with Michael Crawford and the Crawford Military Scholarship Fund, equal shares." Amy filled in the new designations, her pen scratching briskly against the paper. "Done." "And for the CDs, the same." One by one, Tara's name vanished from Helen's financial footprint. It was surgical, methodical. Each stroke of the pen felt like cutting another cord she'd never agreed to tie. When they reached the end of the stack, Amy glanced up. "One more thing to consider. I can set you up with a small private account in just your name, something separate from your primary accounts, for personal expenses only. No one else would even know it exists." Helen smiled faintly. "Let's do that." Amy typed quickly, the screen's glow reflecting in her glasses. "We'll start with a modest deposit. You can add more later if you choose." The printer hummed, spitting out the paperwork. Helen signed where indicated, the ink smooth and final. "You're protecting your legacy," Amy said, her voice low but approving. "A lot of people don't think to do this until it's too late." Helen gathered her copies into the leather folder she'd brought from Charles's office the day before. "It's not just about money, it's about keeping it where it belongs." As she left, the late morning had shifted into early afternoon. The street outside was bright, the air warm but edged with a whisper of breeze. She crossed to the bakery on the corner, its open door spilling the smell of fresh bread and sugar into the air. Inside, the glass case gleamed with neat rows of tarts, eclairs, and pastries dusted with powdered sugar. Helen chose a half-dozen almond croissants for Marjorie, her favorite, and added a lemon tart for herself. The paper bag was still warm in her hands as she walked back to the car. Driving through the historic district, the houses stood like watchful sentinels, their iron balconies draped in moss. Helen felt a strange quiet in herself, not empty, but steady, as if every deliberate action in the past 2 days had tightened the weave of her boundaries. Her phone rang just as she turned onto her street. The display showed Michael. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but tapped the answer button. "Mom," he began. His tone clipped. "Tara wants to talk things out." Helen slowed the car to a crawl, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Does she now? She thinks there's been a misunderstanding. We could meet somewhere." Helen parked in her driveway, setting the croissants gently on the passenger seat. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice even, though in her mind the answer was already decided. The cafe on Broughton Street was all brick walls and exposed beams, with the faint hum of jazz spilling from a hidden speaker. Outside, tourists drifted past the tall windows, pausing to snap photos of the streetcars. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of fresh espresso and cinnamon. Helen chose a small table in the back, where she could see both the door and the sidewalk beyond. She ordered her coffee black, no sugar, and waited. The spoon on the saucer gleamed in the morning light. Tara arrived 7 minutes late, sunglasses still on despite being indoors. She slid into the chair opposite Helen without a greeting, dropping her purse on the floor with a thud. "We need to talk," she said, removing the sunglasses to reveal eyes that were already sharp with accusation. Helen stirred her coffee once, then set the spoon down neatly. "So talk." Tara leaned forward. "You've been making decisions, family decisions without me. You're cutting me out of things I should be a part of. I'm Michael's wife. That means I'm part of this family whether you like it or not." Helen took a slow sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding her. She said nothing. "I've been patient," Tara went on, her bracelets clinking as she gestured, "but I find out you're meeting with lawyers, making changes." She lowered her voice slightly. "And not even telling me. Do you think that's fair?" Helen set her cup down gently, letting the quiet between them stretch. "Fairness," she said finally, "depends on perspective." Tara's lips tightened. "Let me guess. Your perspective is that I don't deserve to know anything." Helen's gaze didn't waver. "My perspective is that I'm capable of making my own decisions." There was a beat of silence. Tara shifted in her chair, then smirked slightly, as though she'd spotted her opening. "Look, I know we've had our differences, but we both know what's going to happen someday. You're not getting younger, Helen, and when that day comes there are certain responsibilities. The house, the accounts." Helen cut her off by reaching into her bag, pulling out a small packet of sugar, and calmly tearing it open. She tipped it into her coffee, stirred, and changed the subject entirely. "How's your garden doing this year? Michael mentioned you planted roses." The shift threw Tara off balance. "What? Roses?" Helen repeated, sipping again. "Savannah soil can be tricky if you don't feed it right." Tara blinked, clearly unprepared to be detoured. "That's not what we're here to." Helen stood, smoothing her jacket. "If you'll excuse me, I have errands." "You're just going to leave?" "Yes," Helen said simply, gathering her purse. "Enjoy your coffee." She left the cafe with the faint chime of the doorbell marking her exit. The sunlight outside was bright enough to make her squint, but she walked with her head high, the noise of traffic and chatter folding around her like a shield. 2 blocks away, she paused to browse the window of an antique shop, not because she needed anything, but because the act of looking at delicate things reminded her of what was worth preserving. By late afternoon, the whole exchange was tucked away in the mental drawer she kept for moments she would not revisit. That is, until her phone buzzed just as she was arranging fresh flowers in a vase. It was Marjorie. "Well," she said without preamble, "news travels fast in this town." Helen straightened. "What news? That friend of yours?" "No, not my friend. Tara. She just found out you removed her from your will." Helen's hand stilled on the vase. "How?" A mutual acquaintance from the garden club ran into her at the market. Apparently, she's not taking it well. Helen looked at the pale petals in her hand, their edges perfect and untouched, and felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing a truth had finally reached its target. The front door banged against the wall hard enough to rattle the framed map of Savannah in the hallway. Helen was in the sitting room, folding yesterday's newspaper for recycling, when Tara's voice came slicing through the house. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Helen didn't look up right away. She set the newspaper aside, smoothed her skirt, and rose. Tara was already in the doorway, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with the kind of rage that fed itself. Michael stood behind her, shoulders tight, his eyes darting between them like he was watching a slow-motion collision. "You've been telling people I'm out of the way?" Tara's voice cracked on the last word, the kind of crack that came from holding back nothing. "Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" Helen crossed to the small secretary desk in the corner, the click of her shoes on the wood steady and unhurried. She opened the narrow drawer and drew out a single manila envelope. "I thought you might want to see for yourself," she said, holding it out. Tara snatched it, tore the flap open, and unfolded the crisp pages. Her eyes scanned the legal language until she found her own name, crossed out in deliberate, unwavering strokes, and the scholarship's name written in its place. "This is disgusting," she spat, her voice rising. "It's legal," Helen said calmly. Tara crumpled the papers in her hands and let them fall to the floor. "You think this makes you look noble? It makes you look bitter." Small. Michael stepped forward, palms out as if he could press the air back into place. "Tara, just let's talk about this." "I am talking," she snapped at him, then turned back to Helen. "You've been undermining me from the start. Every time I try to be part of this family, you shut me out. Well, congratulations, you've just guaranteed I'll never lift a finger for you." Helen's lips curved, not quite into a smile. "I don't recall asking for your help." The room seemed to pulse with silence for a moment before the sharp rap of knuckles broke it. Marjorie stepped in without waiting for an invitation, a grocery tote over her arm. She glanced from Tara to the papers on the floor to Helen, her face unreadable. "Afternoon," she said, moving toward the coffee table as though she'd walked in on nothing more than a mild disagreement over lunch plan. She set down a small box from the bakery, the sugary scent of fresh pastries drifting into the charged air. Tara glared. "This doesn't concern you." Marjorie's eyes slid to her, cool and steady. "Then you can take it to the street." Michael ran a hand down his face. "Can we please just—" But Tara was already moving, snatching up her purse from the arm of the chair. "I'm done here." She stormed toward the door, yanking it open so hard the brass handle struck the wall. The slam that followed rattled the glass panes and sent a brief shiver through the quiet that remained. Michael lingered for a moment, his mouth opening like he might say something, but no words came. He followed her out without looking back. Helen bent down, picked up the crumpled copy of the will, and smoothed it once against her palm before placing it back into the envelope. Marjorie handed her a croissant from the bakery box. "I take it that went exactly how you thought it would." Helen accepted the pastry, her fingers brushing the flaky crust. "Exactly." It was nearly dusk when she checked her email that evening, the lamplight casting a warm glow over the desk. A new message from Charles Benton sat at the top of her inbox. The subject line read, "Property Deed Review." She clicked it open, scanning the first line. "Helen, just a note. While reviewing the files, I noticed Tara is also listed on a property deed you may have forgotten about." Helen leaned back in her chair, the croissant untouched beside her. The game wasn't over yet. Helen read Charles's email twice before clicking open the attached file. The scanned image of the property deed glared back at her from the screen. Neat, official lettering, stamped with a courthouse seal. Her own name was there, of course, but just beneath it sat the words Michael Crawford and spouse, Tara Crawford. Her pulse didn't quicken. It didn't need to. Instead, a slow, cold clarity settled in, the same way fog draped over the marsh before sunrise. She reached for her leather folder, flipping through until she found the property's original purchase agreement from years ago. Daniel had loved that vacation house on Tybee Island. Back then, adding Michael's name had seemed practical. What she hadn't accounted for was the legal hitch. Marriage had brought Tara's name along for the ride. The next morning, Helen was back in Charles Benton's office. The air inside was cooler than the August heat outside, carrying the faint scent of paper and the quiet click of a desk clock. Charles skimmed the deed she handed him. It's a joint ownership by operation of marriage, not uncommon, but it can be undone. Helen leaned forward. Then undo it. He gave a small, approving smile and pulled a fresh set of forms from a file drawer. We'll transfer it into your sole ownership trust. Once it's recorded, she won't have a claim. You'll maintain full control, including the right to sell without their consent. Helen watched as he filled in the lines with practiced efficiency, the soft scratch of his pen marking each stroke. She signed where he indicated, her name flowing in even loops. Charles added his notary stamp, the crisp impression catching the light. When it was done, Helen gathered the documents, the paper cool beneath her fingertips. "Inform Michael," she said. "I'll send a courtesy notice," Charles replied. By late afternoon, Helen was back in her kitchen, pouring sweet tea into tall glasses. The ice clinked softly against the glass as Marjorie settled at the table, eyeing the thick envelope Helen had brought home. "Well?" Marjorie asked. "It's mine now," Helen said, taking a long sip of tea. "All mine." Marjorie raised her glass. "To keeping what's yours." They drank, the clink of their glasses punctuating the quiet satisfaction between them. The cicadas outside were in full chorus, their steady drone folding over the sound of ice shifting in the pitcher. Later that evening, Helen set the updated deed in her desk drawer, sliding it into place beside the will and trust updates. Each document was another brick in the wall she was building, not out of spite, but out of preservation. She was making a second cup of tea when her phone buzzed on the counter. The notification was from a neighbor's group chat. Someone had shared a screenshot from social media. Helen tapped it open. It was a post from Tara. A picture of an empty wine glass on a patio table, the caption reading, "Some people forget who was there for them when they had nothing. But karma remembers." No names, but Helen didn't need them. The timing was obvious. The comments beneath were a mix of sympathy and curiosity, the kind of digital crowd gathering Tara enjoyed. Helen set the phone down, the faint curl of a smile on her lips. The wall was holding. The screenshot arrived in Helen's text messages before she'd even finished her morning tea. A neighbor had forwarded it without comment, though the unspoken thought "you'd want to see this" hovered between the lines. It was the same image she'd glimpsed the night before. Tara's empty wine glass against a dusky backdrop, but now Helen could read the entire thread. "Some people forget who was there for them when they had nothing, but karma remembers." Beneath it, the comments had grown overnight like weeds. A few of Tara's friends chimed in with "you're better off without them," and "some people never change." Others simply posted eye emojis, waiting for more. Helen scrolled once, then twice, then locked her phone and set it face down on the counter. Public attention was exactly what Tara craved, and Helen had no intention of giving her the satisfaction of a reply. Instead, she walked to her desk, powered up the old desktop computer, and opened her email. Within minutes, she had pasted the screenshots into a message to Charles Benton with the subject line, "For the file." His reply came 15 minutes later. "Received, will keep with estate records. Let me know if you want me to send a formal notice to cease slander." Helen typed back one sentence. "Not yet." By mid-morning she was at the bank to make a small deposit into her new private account. Amy Delgado greeted her at the teller counter, her professional smile softening into something warmer. "I saw your email to Charles," Amy said quietly as she counted the bills. "Your accounts are secure. Mrs. Crawford, every POD and beneficiary update is locked in. She can't touch a cent." Helen nodded once. "Good. That's exactly how I want it." Outside, the August sun pressed down, carrying with it the faint briny tang of the nearby river. Helen drove the short distance home with the windows down, letting the wind push the morning static out of her head. Marjorie appeared at her back gate just after lunch, her straw sun hat tilted low. She carried a paper bag from the grocery store, and the faint expression of someone with a fresh headline. "You're in the news," she said, setting the bag on the porch table. Helen arched a brow. "Social news, worse neighborhood news." Marjorie eased into a chair, pulling out a bundle of peaches. "Half the garden club saw that post of hers. You know how fast this crowd works. It's already gone from wine glass and vague captions to Helen's cutting her out of everything." Helen took a peach, felt its fuzz against her palm, and set it in the bowl on the table. "Then the news is accurate." Marjorie's mouth twitched. "Accurate doesn't stop people from filling in the blanks." Helen didn't answer. Instead, she retreated to the back garden, where her roses stood in orderly rows along the fence. The soil was dry in places. She worked the hose slowly along each plant, the water darkening the earth and releasing the deep green scent of leaves and stems. Bees moved lazily from bloom to bloom, the low hum almost meditative. Her hands itched with the urge to prune, so she fetched her shears and began trimming away the spent flowers. Each clean snip felt like a quiet dismissal, petals falling to the ground without fanfare. By the time she finished, the sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft peach and gold. She set the tools aside, brushed the dirt from her gloves, and walked toward the porch. That's when she saw it. An envelope tucked neatly into the front of her screen door. The cream paper was embossed with a small cluster of roses, the handwriting looping and careful. Inside, a single card read, "You are cordially invited to host the September meeting of the Savannah Historic District Garden Club at your home." Helen's lips curved. The date was just 2 weeks away. The September sun laid a warm glow over Helen's backyard, filtering through the tall crib myrtles that edged the property. The air carried the faint perfume of roses and the crisp scent of freshly cut grass. Round tables draped in white linen dotted the lawn, each topped with vases of late-blooming hydrangeas. Pitchers of iced tea and trays of lemon bars waited on the buffet table, alongside plates of cucumber sandwiches cut into neat triangles. By 2 o'clock, the Savannah Historic District Garden Club had gathered, their soft chatter and laughter rising in the shade of the magnolia trees. Helen moved between the tables, offering smiles, refilling glasses, and answering the inevitable questions about her rose beds. It was when she reached the far corner that the low hum of voices shifted. Heads turned toward the side gate, where Tara Crawford walked in unannounced, sunglasses perched high on her head, Michael trailing behind her with a stiff, apologetic expression. Helen's pulse stayed steady. She didn't need to ask how they'd known about the meeting. Word in Savannah traveled faster than the river tide. Tara's heels clicked on the flagstone path, loud enough to claim attention without saying a word. "Well," Tara said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I hope I'm not too late." Helen simply gestured toward an empty chair near the back. "Help yourself to tea." Several neighbors exchanged looks over their glasses. The shift in atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. Polite conversation dipped into a quieter, more careful tone, like a breeze that had suddenly stilled. Helen returned to the center of the lawn, where a small wooden lectern had been placed for announcements. She set her hands on either side of it, the cool varnish under her palms grounding her. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying easily over the murmur of the crowd. "This garden has been my refuge for many years, and it means a great deal to share it with friends who value what's beautiful and lasting." She let her eyes move across the group, noting how Tara had removed her sunglasses, but kept her chin high, as if waiting for her moment to pounce. "I also wanted to take this opportunity to share some news," Helen continued. "In honor of my late husband Daniel Crawford, I have established the Crawford Military Scholarship Fund. It will provide support to veterans and their families pursuing higher education." A ripple of applause moved through the tables, genuine and warm. The sound of it, paired with the clink of ice in glasses, seemed to pull the sunlight in closer. Helen waited for the applause to fade before adding, "The funding came from a careful review of my affairs, making sure that every name on every document truly belonged there." The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Some faces in the crowd registered the meaning immediately, while others glanced sideways, piecing it together. Michael's brow furrowed. Tara's smile froze in place, the muscles in her jaw tightening just enough to notice. I found, Helen went on, her voice even, that unnecessary names take up space meant for better purposes, and so they were removed. The applause that followed was quieter, more deliberate, the kind that came from people who understood exactly what had been said. Tara's hands tightened around her glass of tea, the lemon wedge inside bumping against the rim. Michael shifted beside her, his mouth opening as if to speak, but closing again. Helen stepped back from the lectern, leaving her words to settle among the hydrangeas and the clink of silverware on dessert plates. She smiled as neighbors came up to congratulate her, their eyes bright with curiosity. From the far edge of the lawn, Tara's voice carried faintly, not loud enough to disrupt, but sharp enough for those closest to hear. Helen didn't turn toward her. She didn't need to. The meeting continued as planned, but under the surface, the current had shifted. The garden club's September meeting had started to dissolve into a softer hum. Chairs scraped gently over the flagstone, pitchers of tea sweated on the buffet table, and the air was heavy with the scent of roses mingling with lemon bars. Helen stood near the porch, thanking the last cluster of women for coming. It was then she heard it. Two voices, pitched just low enough to be private, yet carried on a breeze thick with magnolia scent. You know she's not in the will anymore. No, that can't be right. Oh, it's right. She found out last week. Through an absolute fit. Helen didn't turn her head, but her eyes shifted. At the far edge of the lawn, Tara had stopped moving, her paper plate of cucumber sandwiches balanced midair, her gaze locked onto the women whispering, lips parting just slightly, as though to catch every word. A faint flush rose to her cheeks, but the set of her jaw was pure ice. The plate hit the nearest table with a dull, deliberate thud. Tara didn't speak to Helen, didn't offer polite goodbyes to the guests, didn't even glance at Michael. She strode straight to the side gate, heels clicking hard against the flagstone path. The iron latch clanged as it closed behind her, the sound sharp enough to turn a few heads. A ripple moved through the remaining guests, the kind that happens when someone leaves too suddenly. The conversation shifted, light chatter resuming, but Helen caught more sidelong glances now, more murmurs buried beneath compliments about her roses. Michael lingered by the drink table, hands in his pockets. When the last guest's footsteps faded down the street, he walked over, his expression somewhere between weary and apologetic. She's upset, he said, as if it were news. Embarrassed. Helen folded a linen napkin in precise thirds, setting it neatly on the stack. Embarrassment, she said, is a choice people make when they hear the truth. He exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. You could have told her before today. She already knew, Helen replied, her tone even. What she overheard was confirmation. That's different. Michael looked like he might press further, but instead he picked up a platter and followed her into the kitchen. They worked in silence, the soft clink of china and the steady hum of the dishwasher filling the space between them. Marjorie appeared a few minutes later, stepping in from the porch with her straw hat still tilted low. She leaned against the doorframe, watching Helen wrap up the lemon bars. Well, she said, her voice dry but approving, if the goal was to make your point without raising your voice, you did it perfectly. Helen glanced up, allowing herself the smallest smile. It wasn't about making a point. It was about making sure the right story was the one being told. Marjorie picked up a stray teacup, rinsed it in the sink, and set it on the rack. Sometimes they're the same thing, she said, and sometimes that's what stings most. By the time Marjorie left with a paper bag of leftover sandwiches, the house was still. Helen poured herself a glass of sweet tea and stood at the sink, looking out at the garden. The hydrangeas caught the last gold of the setting sun, and the flagstone path gleamed faintly from the watering she'd done the night before. Satisfaction settled over her, but it wasn't a finished feeling. Not yet. There were still loose threads, still documents she hadn't touched. Tara might have been cut from the will, but Helen knew her name could be lurking elsewhere, waiting like an overlooked weed in an otherwise perfect bed. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the display. Amy Delgado. Helen answered. Amy, everything all right? Better than all right, Amy said, her tone brisk but warm. I've been reviewing our last few meetings and thought of something. We've updated your accounts and estate documents, but have you considered your insurance policies, life insurance, annuities, anything that names a beneficiary? Helen's fingers tightened slightly on the glass. I haven't looked at those in a while. They're often worth more than people realize, Amy continued. And if an outdated name is still on them, she let the silence finish the sentence. Helen looked toward the desk in the front parlor, where her neatly organized folders sat. She could almost see the embossed policy envelopes inside, untouched for years. Amy's voice sharpened. We can also update your insurance beneficiaries. Helen's lips curved, slow and deliberate. Then that's what we'll do. The morning was bright but cool, the kind of Savannah day that hinted at autumn without quite letting go of summer. Helen arrived at the bank just as Amy Delgado was unlocking the glass doors. The faint scent of coffee drifted from inside, mingling with the clean tang of freshly polished tile floors. Mrs. Crawford, Amy said warmly, holding the door. Come on in, I've got a quiet office ready for us. Helen followed her past the teller counters into a small conference room. The blinds were tilted just enough to let in strips of sunlight across the table, where a neat stack of folders waited. Amy sat opposite her, flipping open the first file. Let's start with your life insurance policies. You've had these for a long time, good coverage, strong payout, but the beneficiary list hasn't been updated since Daniel passed. Helen adjusted her reading glasses and leaned forward. The top page was a familiar form, but her eyes went straight to the section in question. Primary beneficiary, Michael Crawford. Secondary beneficiary, Tara Crawford. Remove her, Helen said without hesitation. Amy's pen moved smoothly across the paper, drawing a decisive line through Tara's name. Who should replace her as secondary? Helen didn't need to think. The Crawford Military Scholarship Fund. And make sure Michael's children are listed as contingents, divided equally. Amy nodded, filling in the names with steady, even strokes. That takes care of life insurance. Now your annuities. The next folder revealed another familiar signature of neglect. Tara's name printed neatly in black ink beside beneficiary. Again, Helen directed without pause. Michael's children first, then the scholarship fund. No one else. The forms passed between them, the sound of papers shifting and pens gliding across signatures punctuated only by the faint tick of the wall clock. Each signature felt like closing a lock, each notarization like snapping the clasp on a vault. When they were finished, Amy stacked the folders, tapped them into a neat pile, and slid them back into her leather portfolio. That's it. Everything is officially updated and recorded. If anything happens to you, there's no legal pathway for her to receive a cent from these accounts. Helen leaned back slightly, letting the words settle. Outside, she could hear the muffled hum of traffic and the faint beeping of a delivery truck reversing. Good, she said. That's exactly the outcome I wanted. Amy gave her a small smile. You'd be surprised how many people wait until it's too late. You're thorough. I respect that. Helen stood smoothing her jacket and shook Amy's hand. Thank you, Amy, for everything. Marjorie was waiting in her car out front, window rolled down and sunglasses perched on her nose. How'd it go? She asked as Helen climbed in. Efficient, Helen replied, buckling her seatbelt. And final. They drove in companionable silence, the late morning sun casting dappled shadows across the historic district streets. The scent of jasmine from a nearby garden drifted through the open window as Marjorie turned onto Helen's block. You know, Marjorie said, every time you take one of these steps you seem lighter. Helen glanced out at the rows of porches and wrought iron railings. That's because I'm taking the weight off my future. When they pulled into Helen's driveway, Marjorie helped carry in a small box of groceries from the back seat. They exchanged quick goodbyes before Marjorie drove off, her car disappearing beneath the canopy of oak trees. Helen had just set the groceries on the counter when she noticed the envelope on her front hall table. It hadn't been there when she left that morning. The heavy cream paper bore no return address, just her name typed in crisp black letters. She slid it open with the silver letter opener Daniel had once used for Navy correspondence. Inside was a single page on law firm letterhead. Mrs. Crawford, it began. This letter serves as notice of our client's intention to review her rights and entitlements regarding certain family assets and properties. The rest was a blur of legal phrasing, vague, pointed, and dripping with implied threat. At the bottom, the signature of an attorney Helen didn't know. She set the letter down carefully, a faint smile curling at one corner of her mouth. The letter sat on Helen's kitchen table like an intruder who'd made itself comfortable. The crisp cream paper caught the morning light, the embossed law firm seal, pressing a shadow into its surface. She read it twice more over her tea, the words rights and entitlements clanging like dull bells in her mind. By 9 she had it tucked neatly into her leather folder and was walking up the stone steps to Charles Benton's office. The heavy oak door closed behind her with a quiet click, shutting out the sound of passing traffic. Charles glanced up from his desk as she entered, his expression unreadable but alert. "That was quick," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Helen slid the letter across the desk. "This came yesterday." He scanned it, his eyes moving faster than his penmanship ever would. When he finished, he set it down, his fingers steepling, vague on purpose. "They're fishing to see if you'll panic and offer information or concessions. They'll get neither," Helen said. "Good." Charles opened a drawer, withdrew a legal pad and began writing. His handwriting was small, precise, the kind of script that looked like it belonged in a courtroom record. "Will respond formally, citing your sole legal authority over your estate, accounts, and property. No need to address emotion, just facts, law, and precedent." Helen watched the ink flow, each line carving away at the bluff Tara's lawyer had tried to build. The office smelled faintly of leather-bound books and the coffee cooling on Charles's desk. Outside, a gull's cry cut through the muffled city sounds. By the time he finished, the letter was 3 paragraphs, concise, courteous, and absolute. "This will shut it down," Charles said, signing his name with a flourish. "They'll realize quickly they have no standing." Helen took a slow sip from the water glass his receptionist had brought in. "Send it." 2 days later her phone rang as she was pruning the last of her summer roses. Charles's voice was calm but faintly amused. "They've dropped the matter. No follow-up. No further communication expected." Helen clipped another wilted bloom and let it fall to the soil. As expected. That evening the phone rang again. "Michael." She almost didn't answer, but habit won out. "Mom," he began, his tone already taut. "Tara's upset you didn't at least try to talk to her before sicking lawyers on her." Helen leaned against the counter, her free hand resting on the cool granite. "Your wife sent me a legal threat. I answered it with a legal response. That's how adults handle those things. She says this isn't what Daniel would have wanted," Michael pressed. Helen closed her eyes briefly. "Daniel would have wanted peace in this family. She broke that a long time ago." "I'm done explaining myself, Michael." Silence stretched on the line. Finally he sighed. "I don't know how to fix this." "That's because you can't," she said, and ended the call. On Sunday Helen took her usual pew at St. Paul's. The morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, scattering jewels of color across the wooden floor. After the service, Evelyn Parker, one of the older parishioners, approached with her cane tapping softly. "I heard you've been tidying up your affairs," Evelyn said with a knowing smile. "Good for you. The living have to protect what's theirs, Helen." Helen returned the smile. "That's the plan." By the time she got home, there was a new message waiting in her email from Charles. She opened it, expecting a routine follow-up. Instead, the subject line made her pause. "Remaining joint account." The message was short. "There's one last account with her name still on it. Let me know when you want to address it." Helen sat back in her chair, a slow, deliberate smile forming. The following Tuesday, the sky over Savannah was a soft, pale blue, the kind that promised a dry, even light, perfect for business that required clarity. Helen stepped into Charles Benton's office, carrying the leather folder that had become her constant companion these past weeks. The receptionist waved her through without a word. Charles was already standing, a thick file open on his desk. "This is the last one," he said, sliding a single form toward her. "Joint investment account from years ago. You opened it in Daniel's name first, added Michael's later, and when he married, Tara came attached." Helen finished, lowering herself into the chair. The paper smelled faintly of toner, the ink still sharp against the white. Helen took the pen, its metal barrel cool in her hand, and signed in the space marked Primary Account Holder Authorization. The sound of the nib scratching across the page was as satisfying as the soft click of a lock turning. Charles notarized the form, his stamp pressing a raised seal into the bottom corner. "That's it. She's gone from everything." Helen didn't smile, but her shoulders eased just slightly. "Let's review it all. One more time." He brought out a stack of documents: the will, the trust, the property deeds, the bank account designations, the insurance policies. The pile looked like a miniature archive of her life, each page a record of something she'd built, kept, or protected. One by one, they passed through her hands. No Tara, anywhere. Later that afternoon, she carried the stack across the street to Marjorie's front porch. The scent of brewing coffee floated through the screen door as Marjorie waved her in. "I want a second pair of eyes," Helen said, laying the papers on the kitchen table. Marjorie adjusted her glasses and went through them like she was checking the minutes of a meeting. She read silently, occasionally nodding or making a small grunt of approval. When she finished, she looked up, her expression satisfied. "Clean, all of it. She's erased." Helen exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. "Good, then I'm ready for the next step." The next step came the following morning. Helen walked into the downtown branch of the Savannah Community Foundation, the glass doors reflecting the bright mid-morning sun. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with lemon polish. She wrote a check, not for the amount they'd discussed before, but for an additional $50,000, earmarked for the Crawford Military Scholarship Fund. "It's in honor of Daniel," she told the foundation director, who smiled and promised the funds would help veterans and their families immediately. 3 days later, the announcement appeared in the Savannah Morning News. A half-page article, complete with a photograph of Daniel in his Navy uniform, detailed the scholarship's mission and the substantial donation that had just strengthened it. The words "funded entirely through the careful management of Mrs. Crawford's personal estate" made Helen's lips curl faintly as she read. Nowhere in the article was there any mention of Tara. Not her name, not her connection to the family, not even the faintest shadow of her existence. By mid-afternoon, the paper lay folded on Helen's coffee table, the sunlight catching the glossy photo of Daniel. She sat with a cup of tea, the house quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock. Marjorie stopped by, the newspaper tucked under her arm. "Saw your article," she said, handing it over as though Helen hadn't already read it twice. "You handled this with precision." Helen sipped her tea. "It's about making sure what we built goes to people who deserve it. Nothing more." For the first time in weeks there was a sense of completion, but it was a restless kind, the kind that made Helen look past the moment to see what still lay ahead. She glanced toward the envelope in her desk drawer, the one holding the updated deed for the Tybee Island vacation property. It had been Daniel's retreat, a place of salt air and quiet mornings, but lately every thought of it carried the faint taste of intrusion. Tara's name had been there once, even if it wasn't now. The knowledge clung like humidity, heavy and unavoidable. Helen set her teacup down, the porcelain clicking softly against the saucer. "I think it's time," she murmured. Marjorie tilted her head. "Time for what?" Helen's eyes were steady. "To sell the vacation house. Clean break, put the proceeds straight into the scholarship fund." The decision landed between them with the weight of finality, and just enough edge to promise the next move would be as unshakable as every one before it. The next morning, Helen stood at the edge of the Tybee Island porch, letting the wind tangle her hair. The air carried salt and the faint metallic scent of the sea. The horizon was a clean, unbroken line, but her eyes weren't on the water, they were on the weathered shingles of the house itself. It had been Daniel's refuge, a place for early coffee and late sunsets, for quiet conversations with no clock running. But now, even the boards beneath her feet seemed to hum with the memory of Tara's name once being tied to it. It wasn't enough that she'd removed it from the deed. Helen wanted it gone entirely. By midday she was sitting in the bright, glass-walled office of Joyce Mitchell, a realtor who had been a friend of Daniel's since his Navy days. Joyce had a file already open on her desk, the house's photos spread across the glossy pages. "You're sure?" Joyce asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Helen nodded. "List it high, but fair. And no one gets a showing without proof they can close." Joyce's pen moved briskly. "Understood." The listing went live 2 days later. Clean photographs of the porch, the sandy path to the beach, the view from the upstairs windows. Helen didn't tell Michael, and certainly not Tara. Some decisions didn't require consultation. 3 weeks later, Joyce called. "You're going to like this one. Full cash offer, no contingencies. They've already wired the deposit." Helen was in her garden, pruning a stubborn rosebush. She let the news settle over her like the warm September sun on her shoulders. "Accept it," she said. The sale moved quickly, almost disarmingly so. There were no hiccups, no last-minute haggles. Helen signed the closing papers in Joyce's office, while the scent of strong coffee drifted from the break room. Outside, the palms swayed gently in the island breeze, as if they too were waving goodbye. When the final transfer went through, the funds were wired directly to the Crawford Military Scholarship Fund. Helen received the confirmation email in her study. The sum sat there on the screen, a number large enough to change lives, and far more satisfying than seeing it sit idle in her own account. That evening, Marjorie insisted they celebrate. She chose a small seafood place tucked off River Street, the kind with white tablecloths and windows that framed the water in gold as the sun went down. "To clean slates," Marjorie said, raising her glass of Sauvignon Blanc. "To good timing," Helen replied, clinking her glass lightly against hers. The sound was crisp, final. The waiter brought steaming plates of shrimp and grits, the air fragrant with garlic and butter. Helen ate slowly, savoring each bite as much for the company as for the food. For the first time in months, she felt the undercurrent of unfinished business begin to still. On the drive home, her phone buzzed in her handbag. At a red light, she checked it. A text from Michael. "Heard you sold the Tybee place. Hope it went to someone who'll take care of it." No accusation, no plea. Just a short, neutral message. Helen typed back, "It will." She didn't elaborate. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the street lamps had come on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The house was quiet, the air inside still carrying the faint scent of the roses she'd cut earlier that week. She went straight to her desk, opened her laptop, and typed in a new search, "Spring River Cruises Europe." Images of stone bridges, tulip fields, and sunlit vineyards filled the screen. She clicked on one, a 2-week cruise along the Rhine and Danube, complete with balcony cabins and evening chamber music. Her credit card was already in hand when the thought came. The Tybee money had been put to good use. This would be for her. She confirmed the booking. A soft chime announced her reservation, the words "paid in full" glowing on the screen. The package arrived on a Thursday morning, slim and wrapped in plain brown paper. Helen signed for it at the door, her fingertips brushing the cool surface as she carried it into the parlor. The weight was light, but she knew exactly what it held. A piece of her life Tara had tried to destroy and had instead only sharpened in value. She set the package on the table and pulled the letter opener from Daniel's old Navy desk. The blades slipped cleanly through the tape, the sound crisp against the quiet of the house. Inside, cushioned in layers of tissue paper, was the restored photograph Daniel in his dress whites, smiling that quiet, certain smile. Helen beside him in her gown, her veil catching the sunlight on their wedding day. The colors were richer than she remembered, the edges clean, the image sealed behind flawless glass in a new walnut frame. She lifted it carefully, the faint scent of fresh wood polish rising from the frame. For a moment she stood there, tracing the line of Daniel's jaw with her eyes, remembering the way he had looked at her that day, like he'd already decided there was nothing in the world more worth guarding. Crossing the room, Helen placed the photograph back on the mantel, exactly where it had stood before the crash. The afternoon light from the window fell across the glass, catching the white of Daniel's uniform and the soft curve of her smile in the picture. It was as if time had looped, but this time nothing and no one could touch it. She made tea, Darjeeling, the leaves fragrant and earthy as they steeped, and carried her cup to the armchair near the mantel. Outside, the cicadas hummed, their steady drone blending with the faint creak of the old house settling. She sipped slowly, letting the warmth spread through her chest, her gaze drifting between the fireless hearth and the desk across the room. On the desk, a white envelope sat open, its contents fanned neatly: 2 tickets for a spring river cruise through Europe, the itinerary printed in elegant navy script. The Rhine, the Danube, castles, vineyards, and quiet mornings on the water. The idea of leaving Savannah for a stretch of days, to float through places where her name meant nothing to anyone, filled her with a calm anticipation she hadn't felt in years. The phone rang, its old-fashioned chime cutting through the stillness. Helen set her cup down and crossed to the receiver. "Hope you're not backing out on me," Marjorie's voice teased through the line. Helen smiled. "I wouldn't dare. The tickets are sitting right here." "Good. I've already started making a packing list, and I found a shop in town that still sells proper travel hats." They talked for several minutes about the cruise, the meals they'd try, the towns they'd explore, the quiet stretches of river where they'd sit on deck with coffee and watch the world slide by. Marjorie's voice was bright, almost conspiratorial, as if the trip itself were a victory in some private war they'd both fought. When Helen hung up, the house was quiet again. She returned to the mantel, standing before the photograph. The glass reflected her face faintly over her younger self's, a layering of time, of proof that she had endured, and that what she chose to keep had survived with her. Her eyes moved to the desk, to the neatly stacked folders of legal documents. Every page, every clause, every signature was a wall she had built, not to shut herself in, but to keep certain people out. Permanently, she picked up her tea again and settled into the armchair. The light shifted, sliding lower across the room as the day moved toward evening. The scent of roses from the garden drifted through the open window, mingling with the faint tang of lemon from the polish she'd used on the mantel. Helen felt no need to check her phone, no worry about the next move or the next letter. The work was done. The boundaries were set in glass and ink, as unbreakable as she could make them. She glanced once more at Daniel's smile, then at the tidy stack of folders. Some things were worth preserving in plain sight, to remind you of where you've been. Others were best guarded, locked away, safe from the reach of hands that didn't deserve them. Some things you protect with glass, others with every legal shield you can find.